name is Jeremy Ive. I am the Senior Advisor to Relational Peace Building Initiatives. And this is the fifth of our series on the mutual convergent development process, which is the process we first developed in the context of Korea, and which we're also applying to Ukraine. So if you don't know the book, there is no other way to peace in Korea. It's also available in electronic form in Korean, both North and South dialects. So that is available if you want to follow it up. The Ukraine application is still very much in draft, but we are working through that as well. So starting off with, of course, the current situation. As you know, I've mentioned this in previous presentations, the de facto partition from 1945 to 48, slightly adjusted after the Korean War in 1953. And then in the case of Ukraine, the emerging de facto partition based on the lines of contact and control. Now, of course, everything is up in the air at the moment with what we call the track one diplomacy, both coming from US, Russia, and then Ukraine and the European powers. But however it's resolved, there will be some sort of division of the Ukraine area for the future. Not too dissimilar, I would suggest, to what happened in Korea. So the question is, what hope is there for the Korean Peninsula and the Russia-Ukraine situation? We believe that peace is possible, looking beyond the current uncertainties and configurations for the future. And the question is, how do we get there? There's a need for a roadmap setting out a trust-building process to lay the foundation for a peaceful outcome. So what we've been developing is the concept of a mutual convergent development process, bringing together two or more parts of a larger territory so that they have shared, on the basis of shared values, institutions, and policy goals, moving from pragmatic cooperation to a longer-term sustainable peace, widening the areas of cooperation at each phase and dealing with ways to build that common purpose across the divides. So we need to come on to the 5 phases. As you've seen, we've done phases 1, 2, 3, and 4 already in our mutual convergent development process. You can find these on our website under MCD. If you go look at the top on the website, both the recorded presentation and the slides for the previous areas of the previous phases. But today, we're looking at the Federation of Oblasts on the one hand, or Federation of Provinces in the cases of the Korean Peninsula and Ukraine. So how do we get there? Well, what would this look like, rather? We have 2 pillars. The first pillar is the external relationships, which we suggest is best understood in terms of multi-connected neutrality. And the second is the idea of the internal power sharing structure, a much more devolved power sharing structure envisaged for a future federation of the Korean Peninsula or the Ukraine area. Coming to the external relations, the idea of in Korea is that's caught in a rivalry between the US, Japan, and China. Russia does come into this, and at the moment, Russia is playing a very powerful role in sucking North Korea into the confrontation with the West, especially in the case of Ukraine, because it's supplying arms and people, soldiers, to the conflict in Ukraine. And in return, it's supplying the North Koreans with vital elements of fuel, as well as technological assistance. However, we are looking beyond this current situation to when Korea is free from that entanglement entirely, because we are looking at how to resolve the Ukraine question itself. But the Ukraine question, the Ukraine area has become a point of rivalry between the West and Russia. And so our thinking is that as a mutual convergent development process can take root eventually in Ukraine, so it will free up the Korean Peninsula to be much more mutual convergent development area of multi-connected and neutrality across the divides. So the two situations are connected, but there are parallel considerations which we have in view for both. And then there's the problem with both Korea and Ukraine is that they're caught in what is called the Thucydides trap. Now, Graham Allison, who is a key thinker in foreign relations, very influential in the United States, developed this notion of the Thucydides trap. Thucydides was a Greek historian who looked at the Peloponnesian War and the way in which Athens and Sparta were caught up into conflict by being drawn into situations locally, which then sucked them into the wider war. And at the moment, there's a danger of Korea being a point of conflict between the West and Russia or China, and the need then for the Korean Peninsula to be detached from that so it can operate much more freely across all the divides. In order to avoid that, we want to suggest that that there needs to be much better communication, and we need to clarify ways to de-escalate the situation in that context. But that will only come, I think, once the situation in Ukraine has been disentangled. So what happens in Ukraine is that Russia is a power which is trying to, as it were, ward off Western influence moving eastwards. And in reaction to that, it has invaded Ukraine and has got itself caught up into this conflict. And the risk is of direct engagement between NATO, that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which includes the United States and Western Europe and Canada, and then on the other hand, Russia, so that as the conflict in Ukraine deepens and widens, other powers will be drawn into this. And so as is the danger in Korea, with the powers being drawn in there, so is the danger in Ukraine with all the different powers being drawn in across that divide. So that at the moment there's a negative spiral operating. And what we're trying to suggest and envisage is a positive spiral where as Korea, we hope and pray, could become a point of bridge building across those great power divides. So also Ukraine could be a point of bridge building across the divides between Russia and the West. And so instead of seeing it in negative terms as enhancing the confrontation, we could see it in positive terms as providing channels of communication and common purpose across those divides. So moving forward, multi-connected neutrality is the vision. Have an active principled neutrality based on reciprocal economic agreements with all the regional powers. In other words, all the powers are drawn into a web of positive relationships economically, and so there'll be much greater incentive not to engage in the sort of destructive confrontation which is at the moment taking place. As shared economic goals are built on the basis of what we've done in previous phases, so instead of becoming a prize or a point of conflict, the two areas, the Korean Peninsula and the Ukraine area, can become points of cooperation across the divides, building on the one hand a common European home, on the other a common Asian home. And these two can become points of, these can become nexuses of cooperation and common purpose. Internally, in order to cope with the many different communities that there would be in a reunited Korean Peninsula or a reunited Ukraine, there would be a need for much greater local devolution. And here we have the Swiss model, which devolves power as much as possible down to what they call in Switzerland the communes, the communities at a local level, entrusted with the care of their local communal concerns, so that you have the federal government providing oversight of defense, foreign relations, and trade, and then the localities managing a much greater percentage of the fiscal and local affairs than is the case at the moment. So that the bulk, the majority, would then, the majority of taxes and spending would move to the localities rather than to the center. So on the one hand, in the case of Korea, you have a Korean Federation of provinces with a sovereign wealth fund from the north, with safeguarding the north's natural resources, with natural land ownership protection, because if there was a reunified Korea, the danger would be that all the tables would move in and buy everything up and cause great injustice and economic oppression. And there'd also be a need for debt limitation, so that this can't happen, that people aren't sucked into a debt trap. And this would manage the north-south economic gradient, the huge slope which would have to be climbed if there was reunification between the north and the south, because of the differences in the economic basis of the north and the south. It would help to prevent absorption shock. In other words, if there's a sudden reunification, those in the north would be left on the outside of all the benefits, and those in the south would take over the whole thing, very much in the interests of large corporations. It would protect the north population from exploitation, because there'd be much greater devolution, so that all the different provinces would have much greater say over how things were done. And similarly, in the case of Ukraine, there's been great difference of communities, and the Russians moved in to protect what they saw as the rights of local Russian speakers, especially in the southeast. And there were also fears about the Ukrainian forces being used as a weapon against the Russian Federation. But if there was a much more devolved defense structure, this fear could be allayed, and the many minorities in the different communities can be protected, so that there wouldn't be a one-size-fits-all approach to the whole of the Ukraine area, but that the different local needs and priorities could be properly taken care of. And it would also allow for greater regional autonomy. In other words, in the southeast with the more Russian orientation, it would allow them to take their course in terms of what they feel is right for themselves, and would secure the periphery. In other words, that Kiev would not be sucking in all the powers to itself, but that all the different oblasts would have their specific interests and character preserved, and it would provide confidence to the historically divided populations, because many of the different oblasts have come from different historical backgrounds, and they would then be able to work together in a way which gives them confidence that their local identities can be preserved. So in this way, both as a multi-connected, neutral area for Ukraine, as well as for the reunited Korean Peninsula, they would be open to international developments, to the World Trade Organization, to the IMF, the World Bank, UNDP. Although Russia, of course, is a member of the IMF, obviously at the moment the conflict has limited their access to that, and as well as to things like SWIFT, the currency payment system, and so on, would allow for Ukraine and Russia, indeed, as well as the West, to work together much more closely. And similarly, in the case of the Korean Peninsula, with the deepening confrontation between China and the West over recent years, with threat of invasion of Taiwan, for example, it would allow a way to build the bridges again, which have been so badly strained in recent years. A few years ago, even a decade ago, there was much greater cooperation between South Korea and China, and this would help to re-establish that close cooperation and build peace for the future. So that is the vision. On the one hand, externally, this idea of a multi-connected neutral Korean Peninsula and a multi-connected neutral Ukraine area. And then at the same time, having greater local devolution, resolving deep-seated conflicts, both across the continents as well as within the territories themselves. And so instead of the center dominating the peripheries, there could be a working together of all the different localities, as we see, for example, in the Swiss model, in a way that builds confidence locally,